Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Mercola, helping you take control of your health. And today we are joined by Bob Dennis, Dr. Bob Dennis, actually, although he doesn't have a formal medical degree, he has a PhD. And he wrote a new book called Stroke of Luck. And really surprising to find this type of material coming from Bob, but he did. And he wrote it out of personal experience because he recently had a stroke and made magnificent recovery. And I'll certainly let him go into all the specific details. But the reason I wanted to interview him is because it is such a massive problem in the United States. And as we're recording this, yesterday, one of the 52-year-old celebrity, Luke Perry, died from a stroke. And just as an example that this is pervasive in the United States and surprisingly hitting people at a younger and younger age. So, and either you can die acutely like Luke did, or you can suffer with, which in many cases even worse, with severe, profound disabilities for the rest of your life. So Bob is here to discuss his really incredible, it's hard to imagine because he just had a stroke recently, as you'll find out, but that he compiled this entire incredible book as a resource to help people with strokes in such a short time. So I'll let you really expand from here, Bob, because it's your book and we're off to the races, but welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Dr. Mercola. I'm always delighted to talk to you when I get the chance. So I thought I'd mention, what my book is really about. I woke up one morning in June of this year, actually early July of 2018, and realized I had had a stroke while I was in bed. And I could barely talk, but I was able to, get myself to a doctor. And of course, they loaded me immediately onto an ambulance and took me to the hospital. And so I was really aware of what was going on, what was happening. And I paid very close attention to what they were asking me to do and what they were telling me. And of course, I was outside the 3-hour thrombolytic window, so that was not an option. So I knew I was in for a really long, slow.
Well, why don't we stop there? Because some people watching this may not understand what thrombolytic window means. So
yes, that's a good point. So the standard of care now, as I understand it, is that when you have a stroke, within 3 hours, they can give you thrombolytics, which are just chemicals that they give you intravenously, I think it's very fast that way, to break up a thrombus or a clot. So 85% of strokes are clots, 15% are hemorrhagic bleeds. But for the 85% that are a clot, if you catch the person within the 3-hour window, you can give them a thrombolytic, and it apparently rolls back the clock and preserves brain tissue without permanent, death of the neurons. And
and in that 3 hours, you have to differentiate between the two, because you have to give one to the hemorrhagic. If you give that therapy to their hemorrhagic stroke, you'll kill them.
Yes, it's disastrous. So they always ask you, as you're riding into the hospital, they ask you about 50 times since the last normal. When was the last time you felt normal? And then they pin down the time, and then the first thing they do is they throw you into an MRI, and they image your brain to see, was it a thrombus, or was it, ischemic, a clot, sort of, or what? Not really a clot, it's a plug, and or was it hemorrhagic? And when they did mine, they actually discovered that I had had a previous stroke. So this is actually my second stroke. I had another one about 4 or 5 years earlier.
And you're not too old now, are you, Bob?
I'm 55.
55. So a little older than Luke Perry just passed.
A little bit, but I'm about getting to be about that age. Although I'm a little surprised because there's a lot of things I was doing that would have prevented it, except for the last few years where I had all that chronic pain that you know about because you and I have discussed it. And I was really just not able to be as active as I wanted to be. I couldn't really even stand up straight. I couldn't walk more than a few steps. Really quite difficult. But then since the second stroke, the very first thing I noticed, the instant I had a stroke, I also noticed that I had no more chronic pain. I had no more pain at all. I thought, well, either this is really the end or something wonderful has happened. So anyway, the thing is that I paid very close attention as I was going into the hospital, what they were asking me and what they were telling me. And then I paid very close attention to how they were assessing me the whole time. Fortunately for me, most of my colleagues are neurophysiologists. So on the very first day, I was able to call my friends and ask them, or have my wife ask them, what should I be doing to get a the best possible recovery. So I got a lot of real expert opinions on it from my colleagues. And I later, let Dr. Mercola know that I'd had a stroke, and he had some opinions on the subject, which were very helpful. A few other friends of mine. So interestingly, within the mainstream medical care, they basically had a fork in the path. Either you get thrombolytics, or they hold you for a while in the hospital, evaluate you, and then send you home. And I kept asking the mainstream physicians, what should I be doing? What should I be doing to improve my recovery? And they kept saying, well, take your meds, which are statins. I know how you feel about that, but so do I. And baby aspirin, and consider trying a Mediterranean diet. And then the last thing was, they said, well, you should go to PT too. Now, I spoke to everybody who was at the hospital, a level 1 neurotrauma stroke center. And that was sum total of all of their advice. And I was thinking to myself, seriously, come on, this happens to what, 800,000 Americans a year? I know there's things you can do after stroke. Where's the good advice? And it wasn't forthcoming, no matter who I talked to, residents, nurses, doctors, neurologists in the mainstream system. My colleagues told me a lot more. And of course I knew a lot more because I'm a medical design, medical tissue, engineer. So I knew a lot more than they were telling me. So I got kind of a little angry about the fact that they don't give good advice. Like, they basically give you the advice, just lie there and wait, which in my opinion, lying around and relaxing and waiting after a stroke is the worst thing you can do. Once you know it's not hemorrhagic, you should be doing things to promote your neuroplasticity. And that's what I did. So they didn't really have any advice to give me. So I actually just started doing what I knew was right. So they would give me these, what I would call rapid assessment tests, right? They would say things like, flip your hand over on your knee like this. And I had a real difficulty with that with my left hand, right? And then they would say, follow, do eye tracking, things like that. But then they would ask you to, they'd hold up an object and say, what is this? And I had real difficulty saying words. I knew what they were right away. I had no trouble recalling them. I just couldn't, enunciate them. And so I remember every time they gave me one of these rapid assessment tests, and as soon as they turned their back, I would start practicing. And I talk about this in the book, because the book, I have little, stories about what I did. And you probably remember this one. One of the residents pointed at a computer in the emergency room. I was still on the gurney. They hadn't even taken me off the gurney yet. I was not even officially admitted to the emergency room yet. And he pointed at a computer. He said, what's that? And I tried to say it. I tried to say workstation. It was like, sounded terrible. And I couldn't say it. And so, he walked off, and he came back about an hour later and said, and he looked at his attending, which is sort of his boss, doctor, that's teaching him how to be a doctor. And he pointed at the workstation again, because he wanted him to hear how I said that word. And he said, what's that? And I said, workstation. And he literally looked like somebody had just, electrocuted him. And he said, holy, I won't say the word he said, but he said, how'd you do that? And I said, well, it sounded bad the first 500 times I said it, but after I said it, and this was about an hour later, right? So my story, and this is exactly how my entire recovery went. If I couldn't do something, I did it over and over and over again until I could do it, And so I recovered to the point where I couldn't stand, I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk. By the end of the first day, I was pretty much ambulatory and I could communicate with people. One day. So I'm no genius. I'm just a regular guy, but that is neuroplasticity right there happening. And you can make the most of it. And no one said anything about it to me. And I kept asking, and nobody told me this. It's the worst advice you can get in a hospital is just relax, wait, we'll get to you. And they did the same thing to me for physical therapy. Oh, we'll get to you in about 3 weeks. Well, right after your brain is injured, you have this period, this brief window of immense neuroplasticity, and you need to take advantage of it. So I got kind of a little ticked off by this whole system, and I was like, you know what, somebody needs to start telling people this, because I believe it's absolutely true. which is as soon as you have a stroke, make sure you start doing things, especially the things that they've asked you to do when they're assessing you, because those things are safe, they're effective, they zero in on your problem, and you can do them without any special equipment, right? One of the ones they asked me to do was say, like, talk like a baby, da, 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 ma, 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 which I couldn't do, right? Mm-hmm. But you can sit in a gurney and you can go da, 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 da until you can do it, right? And all of these things. So I list all of them in the book because I think that's a really good place to start. So my advice, and I put this right at the beginning of the book so that you can just read it for free. It's on Amazon. I really don't want to charge anything for this book. I just want people to have it. So you know, it's outrageous to get it in hard copy, but it's really designed as an ebook. It's designed so that you can change the font size and so that you can get it for very little money, and also as an ebook, you can have it the day you need it, which is the day you have a stroke, right? You don't have to wait for it to be delivered. And the idea is you can have it even before you have it, you know, so you can look at the summary and I tell you what I did and what I thought was important right before the table of contents so that it's right there for free on Amazon. Because I'm kind of, as a public service, I just want people to know this, because if people just have that little piece of information, whatever you're having trouble with, just keep doing it.
Yeah. Let me just interject here on this incredible illustration that you've just provided of neuroplasticity, because we didn't really provide a term for it and some people may not understand what that is, but essentially it's the ability of your brain to rewire itself. And I've never heard of another story like yours where you were actually able to recover the damage, the function of the damaged cells in such a short time. So what you're doing by that training is that you're developing alternate pathways that bypass the original neurons that were responsible for that action.
That is absolutely correct.
And as you said, the sooner you do it, the better. So I just wanted people to have that foundation so they could more deeply appreciate what you're doing.
In the full-length version of the book, which is about 600 pages in hard copy, I talk about all of that mechanism of neuroplasticity, you know, at great length. And people have argued about neuroplasticity for decades now, neurologists, and especially neurophysiologists. But it turns out that neuroplasticity is something that happens every time you learn something, right? And you can take different kinds of supplements and drugs and just food substances, which are thought of as nootropics, that and that sometimes they explicitly say, you know, this promotes neuroplasticity. And if you put in the term neuroplasticity, just as a Google search term, there's all kinds of blogs on it. And I downloaded and I show a few of these blogs, and they're all very similar. They all amount to the following: do novel things, keep moving, keep learning, keep trying things, keep challenging yourself. You don't have to have a stroke to have neuroplasticity, right? It happens when your brain is working. So the traditional belief is that you only have a short time after a stroke to do your recovery. And then after about 6 months, you can't recover anymore. But there are people who never even had a stroke who are enhancing their own neuroplasticity just by doing novel things, challenging their brain, and exercising the brain neuroplasticity. And I think the converse is true too. Like when people stop challenging their mind, they stop doing challenging new things, and they go into a nice, quiet, isolated retirement, what happens to them? You know, we know what happens to them. They don't do well. Your brain needs to be challenged. And interestingly, the human brain is very, very well adapted to certain kinds of things, right? Not just doing crossword puzzles, because I'm pretty sure they didn't have crossword puzzles, you know, when we were Homo erectus, you know, running across the African savannah. But the human brain is really good at certain things, and it quickly adapts to those things, like recognizing faces, talking to people, navigating through space. And if you do those things, you're naturally enhancing neuroplasticity. So that's really what the book is all about.
That's great. So, and I give a little backstory of how we first met. Initially, I learned of your work because you produce, as you referenced earlier, biomedical device, or you're a biomedical engineer. And in my estimation and review of the field, probably produced the finest PEMF device. And, you know, some people are concerned about EMF, but this is the beneficial EMF that actually can stimulate healing in your tissue because of the frequencies and wavelengths and a few other characteristics. And you designed a system that is the most cost affordable one out there, literally better than units that cost orders of magnitude more than yours. It's under $1,000 and crazy. And I use it pretty much every day myself personally. So as a result of that interaction, and your device is called the M1 Alpha?
ICES.
ICES, M1. So if you just type that in Google, you'll find it. But because of that interaction, I introduced you to Dr. Lee Cowden, one of my mentors, and you've spoken at ACIM, the Association for American? No, it's not American.
It's American College of Integrative
Is it American? No, it's not the American College. It's a comprehensive, I forget what the A stands for.
Association of Comprehensive I'm sorry, the American College is the group.
Association of Comprehensive Integrative Medicine, ACIM, which meets quarterly, typically in Dallas, but every year they have an annual event in November in Orlando, Florida. And you've been there the last 2 years. So I just take a little side tangent. We'll go back to the stroke book. And I'm wondering if you could share your experiences at that event, because this last time you had already had your stroke there for 3 months.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've gone to a lot of scientific conferences. My background is, biomedical engineering and biophysics. I've been to, Biophysical Society, biology conferences, different medical conferences, plastic surgery conferences. So, a lot of the people that I run with are, pretty high level in these different levels of conferences on gerontology. I actually helped organize a big conference on gerontology, had a lot of people there 20 years ago in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I went to ACIM without any expectations one way or the other than that Dr. Mercola had invited me, and it sounded good. But I actually had a very, very good experience at ACIM, and I recommend that people go to it because there's a tremendous diversity of thinking and opinions about health. And I'm sort of on the straight-laced, bow tie wearing scientist end of the spectrum. I talk about electromagnetism and differential equations and what we know about biophysics. But also the thing that I really talk about is that DEMF really works, but we just don't know why, right? Mm-hmm. And that's accepted. That's embraced by the community of clinicians and scholars who go to ACIM. It is not embraced by the community of scholars who study mainstream medicine, not at all. They're like, well, if you can't describe the mechanism, then it can't possibly work, which is not true. It's not true at all. In fact, most things in medicine, we knew they worked pretty well and they were pretty safe and pretty effective long before we understood exactly why.
Yeah, when I was in medical school taking pharmacology, they did it at that time, and that was in the 70s. They didn't understand how aspirin worked, and it was discovered shortly after I graduated, but the actual mechanism. So, I mean, that was a profound one. The aspirin had been around for probably close to 100 years.
Yeah, it had been. It absolutely had been. In fact, morphine, I guess, was the first isolated compound in sort of modern times, and that was in 1805, 1807. So it's been 200 years, and they still to this day are discovering new mechanisms for that. So, and the example I always give is if I'm in a room with a bunch of mainstream doctors, I ask a very leading question to kind of help them get perspective. And I ask them, would you prescribe or would you perform a procedure or medication that you didn't fully understand? Would you do that to a patient? And they all uniformly say, no, no way, right? And then I ask them, well, okay, have you ever given anybody anesthesia? And then the room gets really quiet because it turns out anesthesia is a great medical mystery. We know that it seems to put people out and it alters their memory and consciousness of pain. But scientifically, we don't really know what pain is. Not really, not at a deep level. We don't understand what consciousness is, and we don't understand what memory is or even where it resides in the brain. So we certainly don't understand how a chemical that can be very similar to other chemicals does that. And that's one of the great pillars, one of the three great pillars of modern medicine is anesthesia. And we have no idea at all why it works.
Yeah, well, let's get back to the stroke thing, because I think I don't want to go, we can go on deep tangent for hours. But your book is just a magnificent compilation of resources, practical resources, like things that you can use in your home, like materials and make sure that you don't slip and fall on the stairs, and hundreds and hundreds of other examples like that.
Honestly, I sat there and I mostly typed out what I already knew or what I had discovered right then, things I had found right then that were useful. And I when I started it, I thought it was going to be a pamphlet, like a trifold. And it ended up being 850 pages. I was like, yikes, I got to cut this down. So I did. But it took no time at all to write it because it's so obvious. And as you say, a lot of the background was just there.
Yeah.
Right? It was kind of like a stream of consciousness. So then I had to sit it down for a week or two and came back and edited it for 6 weeks.
Yeah, well, you're a real inspiration, because I write a lot of books. In fact, Peter Drucker, who was a pretty prolific author, wrote 2/3 of his book after the age of 65. And you're not even close to that yet. And boy, you if you wanted to, you could have a lot of books. I mean, that was really one of his only things, because he was a teacher, but you had a lot of other
well, one of the things I talk about is that your brain does change after a stroke. Yeah. And my things that I like and things that I'm passionate about now are different than they were last year. And it turns out I actually really like writing books. And I had no idea. And my son even said, you've got a new superpower.
I'd like you to discuss some of the specific lifestyle interventions that you underwent. And I think maybe you can start with this intermittent fasting, which is such a profoundly powerful tool. And really, it's radically changed your life.
Absolutely radically changed my life.
For a large part of your recovery.
Absolutely did. And now the book mostly is about attitude and exercises for your mind and for your body, because your musculoskeletal system does interact with your body. But I do spend some time talking about how different things like supplements and different technologies like hyperbaric oxygen, things like that, can be helpful. But I'm not an expert in those, and I don't think I'm really, plowing new ground there. So I do just mention them. There's a lot better resources that you can get on the internet, and also it's something that you don't need to know right away. Mm-hmm. So but you should know it. And Dr. Mercola gives an excellent example, which is intermittent fasting. Now, I don't think anybody should wait to have a stroke to start doing intermittent fasting, right? I mean, in fact, nothing in that book you should not wait, because it's all about making your brain more agile. But intermittent fasting, if I could wind the clock back to when I was a kid, there would be one change that I would make in my life. And that would be that I would stop eating all the time. I would intermittently fast, because when I was a kid, all the way up through the day I left for college, through high school, I was thin, I was very fit, I was extremely active, I was outside all the time, and about every other meal, I just skipped it because I didn't even come to my mind. I was never hungry. I just, if I was hungry, I'd go home and I'd eat something about once a day, and the rest of the time I was outside, climbing trees and building forts and all that stuff that kids are supposed to do. If you're younger than a certain age, maybe you didn't do that, but that's what we used to do in the 60s and 70s. Is, well, how we spent our time. And then I went to college, and they give you meals every couple of hours in a dormitory, and you sit and you study. So big changes if I could go back and roll back the clock, change number one, intermittent fasting. I would eat one time a day. And now I eat once a day, and I'm, after a lifetime of having cultivated the wrong habit, I don't understand why anybody eats more than once a day, because you just, once you start doing it, you can tell me, Dr. Mercola, once you start eating once a day and you eat well, you're just not hungry the rest of the time.
Well, let me refine that approach.
Yeah, I'm sure
I've studied this quite extensively, and actually have my new book coming out. I don't know if it'll be out by the time this interview is published, but it's called Keto Fast. So I've been a passionate fan of intermittent eating. And you had lost 52 pounds since your stroke with this strategy. And so you were kind of a setup for this type of eating where you're essentially low calorie or calorie restricted for a significant length of time. But once you get to your ideal level, and I think you still have a little ways to go, but you're getting close.
Yeah.
So once you get your ideal level, then that approach can be actually counterproductive and can actually cause health problems and complications. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, you have to be careful. So but you were right. You need to be cycling. And when you referenced your experiences in childhood, that was really the optimum, so that you're eating when you felt the need and you didn't need. So it was this, and it doesn't have to be a specific schedule, but you have to, but for most of us, because we have life cycles and appointments to keep, so it kind of helps if we make a schedule, but there's no predefined right or wrong. But the general principle, which is what I love about your book, is you just provide these general principles. But with respect to the calories, it's eating to a restricted window pretty regularly. It doesn't have to be extreme, just one meal. You can, in fact, I think the ideal is probably closer to 4 or 6 hours a day. So once you reach your level, so basically not eating for 18, and then on top of that, provide longer fasting. So for one day, maybe twice a week,
right,
you only have 600 calories. So you're eating 600 calories in 42 hours, which is a partial fast, far safer, and you can do it twice a week for the rest of your life.
Well, I agree with you. I think what I'm doing now is just what's easy. It's just narrowing it to a window. And I will also say that the data that I've taken concurs exactly with what you're saying. So like all other things about your body and your physiology, being able to go into ketosis is something you can exercise, right? So when you first start doing this, it might take you 16 or 18 hours to really get your enzymes switched over to ketosis. But when you get used to it, and it's uncomfortable too. You feel like, I'm starving, I need some food, my brain's dying. But once you shift into ketosis, once you've exercised the enzymatic mechanisms necessary, it becomes quite easy. And so I tracked myself with one of those, breathalyzer ketone devices. And what I found was that I was shifting sooner and more quickly, consistently over time. And so, I think that if you want to start with this, it helped me anyway. I started with a really narrow window so that I'd have 22 hours of fasting before I ate anything. But now I'm sure I can shift into ketosis in 12, 13, 14 hours, no problem.
Yeah.
So that means the window that I could eat in without disturbing that cycle is much larger.
Yeah, you don't have to be as rigid to compensate for some of your earlier poor choices. So, but once you're there and you've reached it, then you become you have a lot more options, and it's actually a lot easier to do.
Well, as in all things in life, I think varying how you do it and having some variability and some flexibility and paying attention to your body and how you respond to it is a good thing. So I don't believe in any kind of rigidity like that at all, certainly not for a long term. That's kind of what I emphasize in the book, right? Like some people were asking, well, what's the perfect stroke recovery exercise? And I say this at least twice in the book. There is no such thing, because the exercises you do have to be novel and they have to challenge you. And as soon as you get good at them, as soon as you are comfortable with them, that means they're not as good anymore. You need to move on to something else. So the best stroke recovery exercise, in my opinion, is to be constantly looking for a new one, a new exercise. And that's the whole point of my book, is not that you sit down and read it cover to cover. Treat it more like a reference, like a resource material that gives you ideas about different ways to approach neuroplasticity, from explicit exercises to mental attitudes to habits, right? Just life change habits. And so what if, as many as I could.
Aside from the pretty dramatic example you shared when you were on the gurney trying to identify the workstation, do you have any other similar improvements that you can share with some exercises you've been doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, virtually everything, and I don't mean to make light of it, because stroke is a really bad thing. But there's a lot of things I can do now that I couldn't do before. I had been practicing my balance for a long time, and I was never very good at balancing.
This is before the stroke.
Before the stroke, never, even when I was young. My balance was okay, but it wasn't outstanding. But now it's outstanding, and I know it's outstanding because I've had it measured by what's called a sensory organization test, right? Where they actually put you in a box and they move the box around, they move the platform around, and they see if you can balance. But I did this from exercising. And what I did was I tried to utilize the natural neuroplasticity that I got because of the stroke to try to improve everything about my neuromotor system and everything. So one example was, you can do the Romberg, which is like the roadside sobriety test, heel to toe. And I can actually do better at that now than 80% of the normal population. And I couldn't even stand up at first. So I can actually stand heel to toe, and then you can do what's called a modified Romberg, which is look up. And most people, 75% of people just fall over when they do that. I have no trouble. I can do that all day, but I couldn't. But that's the result of exercise. Another thing is I am now ambidextrous. I tried for many years on and off to learn to write with my left hand. Never really did anything. But when I was in a state of, extreme neuroplasticity, I picked it up. And within 100 lines, I went from not being able to write at all with my left hand to now my penmanship with my left hand is better than my right hand. So, it just goes on and on like this. It's like virtually anything. My speech, my ability to cough, and some things turned out to be better than they were before I had a stroke because I was using neuroplasticity to modify either that habit, that behavior, or maybe that deficit.
All right, let's go back to the title of the book, Stroke of Luck, which implies a bit of being an inverse paranoid, in that which is a concept that bad things will happen to each and every one of us. It's inevitable. You just are not going to escape that. But being an inverse paranoid, you're seeing what good can come out of that. And in your case, there's tremendous good. And one of the reasons you went and developed your PEMF device initially was because you had suffered from, like many people in our population, just from low back pain. And so why don't you discuss what happened to this pain after your stroke?
Well, as you said, I had this lower back pain, and I had been developing these PEMF devices for NASA, and nothing else worked, and they had me on opioids, so I developed, the PEMF device, and it actually worked really well for my lower back pain, general aches and pains, injuries, and stuff like that. But then about 4 or 5 years ago, I started developing the chronic regional pain syndrome in my pelvis and legs, which means I was just in pain. And it was probably centrally mediated, which means it was probably something in my brain because the PEMF was not helping with the CRPS. And you can look that up. It's a terrible, terrible condition. It's got the highest, on average, the highest pain scale rating of any condition. And there's virtually no treatment for it. And the thing that's horrifying about this now, Dr. Mercola, is younger and younger people are actually getting CRPS. In fact, there's cases of 11 and 12-year-old children getting this disease that once was relegated to the old, right? And so something's terribly, terribly wrong in our environment. Hopefully we can figure that out and change it. But anyway, I started getting CRPS, and it was terrible. And I did everything that I could. I threw every scrap of knowledge that I had at it, and it wasn't getting better. And then when I had the stroke and I came out of it the next morning, the pain was gone. So I can tell you that since the Civil War, they had actually been doing brain lesions to reduce central mediated pain. So they would actually trough in your head. Surgeons would do this and lesion, they'd poke your brain with a probe and say, is this where it hurts? Is that where it hurts? And when they found where on your brain was representing the area that was in pain, they would actually lesion it. And that would actually relieve chronic pain for people who had CRPS. So this has been around for a long time. And they stopped doing that in the 1960s because it fell out of favor because nobody wants to have their head carved open. But it is known that certain types of pain are because your brain is miswired, right? So when I had my stroke, I was so fortunate, and I did talk to Dr. Mercola about it. He said, geez, maybe your brain just zorched out the bad circuits. And I think that's exactly what happened. I think my brain was under such chronic stress that it really put stress on those, and that's the area that ischemic stroke. So I mentioned this to the neurologist, every neurologist that I talked to at UNC, and all of them sort of looked at me, ha ha ha, Nice. I already know everything there is to know about the brain, but thanks for telling me, right? And most of them would say, well, you're just a medical mystery. You're lucky, think you're lucky stars. But one guy actually had the temerity, the hubris to say to me, he said, well, if you know anything about the brain, you had a pond stroke and that is not where you feel pain. So that doesn't make any sense. And I said, John, well, I do know a little bit about it. And there's a big switchboard in your brain. And okay, you do get vicariation, which means it's like the word vicarious, comes from the same root word, where one set of brain circuits, it's not just neurons, it's more than neurons going on in your brain. Don't let anybody tell you it's how neurons are connected, because it's a lot more important than that. It's glial cells and everything. But if one area, one zone, one region is damaged, you can vicariate, which means that a different area of the brain can actually take over that function and adopt it. A lot of people do not know this, but the schematic of the brain, I actually have this in the book, where you just color code different regions of the brain. Like this is the frontal lobe and it does this, and this is the prefrontal cortex and it has these functions, and the pons does this. Actually, that entire map was based on data from one brain. And so all of mainstream medicine believes that all brains work exactly that way. And by and large, they do, but it's not nearly as cut and dried as medical textbooks would. Not even close.
Yes, if you've ever taken an anatomy class, you could figure that out real quickly, because you're just astounded at the wide variety of anatomical structures that are there or are not there.
Yeah, and some people can have almost all their brain gone, and then they can regain function or develop function that's almost normal. And other people have a very small lesion and they can be permanently disabled. There's a lot about the brain that we just don't understand. But we do understand that under the right conditions, it can rewire itself. And so what I wrote about, what I've been thinking about nonstop for 7 months now is, how can I condense that information into the smallest possible package and just make it available to everybody?
Yeah, I'm just shocked that you compiled this research in such a short time. The book of this magnitude literally takes more than a year, and yet you had it published within 6 months, which is just astounding. It's almost beyond comprehension. I mean,
the last 6 weeks, I just was editing. I was just 6 weeks of editing. So I really wrote the book in about 4.5 months.
Wow, it's crazy. So, but getting back to your pain syndrome, was the pain gone? It wasn't clear to me. Was the pain gone immediately after your stroke, or was it a result of the exercises that you were doing to rewire your brain?
It was gone immediately after the stroke. And so I had a short list of things that I definitely wanted, and a short list of things that I definitely did not want to have happen after a stroke. And I talk about this in the book. After a stroke, you don't want to injure yourself, because you've got to stay active. So don't, stub a toe, don't break a leg, don't fall. And so I have a whole section on making your house safe. I do have a lot of experience with this because I'm a retired firefighter. In fact, I was fire chief here in this area of North Carolina for about 3 years. So I have, I'm a fully certified, safety, firefighting, first responder, and I can tell you how people hurt themselves. Stairs are the number one thing that hurts people, and besides cars, right? And stairs really are the number one thing. And, if stupid people, stay away from them. You don't need them anywhere near it. But stairs are all over your environment, so you need to learn something. So part of safety in stairs is behavioral, and part of it is physical, right? So I go through all of that. But as far as the pain is concerned, it just vanished. I woke up and it was gone, and I noticed it instantly. I noticed it maybe even before I noticed I had a stroke, because the reduction in pain was so profound. So my short list of things I wanted was, I wanted a full recovery of my brain, but I did not want the pain back. So I didn't want all of the circuits to vicariate, right? I only wanted the good ones to vicariate. And so I think I've been about 90% successful, because I had a little tiny bit of pain, but now I'm able to exercise and make that go away. So the pain started coming back, but because I was doing the right exercises, because I was doing the right things, and a lot of this is right on Mercola.com. And I'm not just plugging you because you're there. I'm plugging you because this is a really great resource. You can go on there, and there's all kinds of exercises and things you can do that are really good, that are really appropriately presented for people at every level. And, I was able to do a lot there, and I was able to take the knowledge that I had and apply it to the exercises. So I was able to selectively exercise different parts of my brain. So that was a different part of the book, right? So in the book, I tried to make it a resource. So I boil down, like, what does the brain really do? What do we really know? And if you want to exercise this kind of sensory input for this kind of motor activity or mental activity, you can do these kinds of exercises. And I tried to do that. And I think I've been really very successful doing that, because I didn't get the pain back, maybe just a little tiny bit, but it's totally tolerable. It's less than I would have expected just being 50 years old, right? Mm-hmm. Some people, such as Dr. Cowden, he believes you shouldn't have any pain. He's made sure he told me that. And I think he's right. That's the kind of world I want to live in. But I live in a world where you do have a little bit of pain, and that's manageable. And so, so if you use neuroplasticity intelligently and you're exercising the right things, it's not just that your brain, I guess the story here that Dr. Mercola is trying to pull out of me, and I'm talking a lot, but I think what he's trying to pull out of me is the fact that I didn't recover every function of my brain because I left the dysfunctions behind, because I was not exercising them. And I exercised the disabilities I had, and I recovered from them almost entirely. But the third thing I did, and I've never heard anybody talk about this, was I used that neuroplasticity to improve everything else. So like I said, I'm ambidextrous now. I can write with both hands. I can balance a lot better. I can use my sensory inputs a lot better for balance and motion. A lot of things. Now, I'm not advocating that anybody whack their head and hope that things are better, because that's just ignorant. I'll do that. Yeah. But I am saying that neuroplasticity is unbelievably powerful. And if you're in a position where you have a stroke or not, you can use neuroplasticity to fix things that are broken, to help to exclude things that are wrong. Part of neuroplasticity is habituation, right? We talked about this. So if, like, I have a left vestibular problem, so I used habituation, which is a form of neuroplasticity, to tune that down so that that bad signal of balance is very small, and it's dominated by the good signals that I want. And I talk about that in the book at length, about how to do that.
Yeah, it's a great resource. So the first time we met at ACIM, which was a year and a half ago, I believe, I noticed that you had a ptosis of one of your eyelids, a drooping. And I believe was that related to your first stroke that you had?
I think it was. Do you see it now? Because I don't feel like it's as pronounced at all.
No, like it's hardly noticeable, but
it's still a little bit there. But it was very noticeable when I first met you a year and a half ago. Yeah. But that was after the first undetected stroke, the undiagnosed stroke. But it was after that one, but it was before my second stroke, which was just a half a year ago. And after that, a lot of problems went away. Like a lot of my gait problems, they were fixed. I'm not sure how much of that was pain, and I'm not sure how much of that was just rewiring. The reduction of pain maybe improved my gait, but also I lost I'd say 90% of that ptosis went away. And I also had a loss of sensation on the left side of my face, and the sensation has returned. So,
was that spontaneous, or were there any specific exercises you did to improve that?
Well, I will tell you, I think it came on slowly. I don't think that I think the pain went away, boom, that instant. But I think the recovery was actually progressive. That was the way I perceived it. And I think it was a combination of the exercises that were explicit, but also neuroplasticity is a general thing. So if you're exercising enough areas in your brain, you get a total brain response of neuroplasticity. It is known, for example, that one area with one lesion of a stroke in your brain will actually cause neuroplasticity throughout the brain. So if you are actively encouraging neuroplasticity in enough different places in your brain, you're actually, the rising tide lifts all boats. And a lot of things just get better because your brain is in the zone. It's in the mode to rewire itself, and it does.
So prior to your stroke, there was really no reason for you to study this. And obviously after you had it, there was enormous motivation to do that. So I'm wondering if you could put your experience and frame it in the normal experience of a person who has a stroke. I haven't studied it carefully, but my guess is that you'd be in the radical extreme of someone who has suffered from, and that most people who've gone through what you did would probably be left with severe residual disability and have, you know, basically nowhere near the recovery you have. So,
well, I don't want to be too angry about this, but if I had done exactly what they advised, I would be sitting in a chair right now or lying in bed, not really able to speak very well. If I had waited for the system to catch up with me and call my number and say, okay, we can give you physical therapy now, and if I had just gone to physical therapy, if I had just done what was prescribed and advised, I don't think my recovery would have been very good. I certainly could not have given this interview.
yeah.
No way I could have said any of these words, right? However, because I found out that I couldn't even get into physical therapy for 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital, you know, I said, the heck with this. And so I developed my own physical therapy and rehab for myself. And it was so funny because when I actually got into physical therapy, and don't get me wrong, the physical therapists were excellent. All the healthcare providers that I interacted with, they by far were the most helpful. And they were the most, you know, directly kind and helpful and knowledgeable of any of the specialties that I interacted with. But the system is so dysfunctional that it took me 3 weeks just to get an appointment with them. But when I got my appointment, I got there, they started evaluating me. They said, whoa, you're able to do all these things, and your medical report says you can't. So without any PT, I was already able to recover about 80 or 90% of the way that I wanted to get before I ever saw a physical therapist, right? So I think your statement is absolutely correct. If you do just what they advise you to do, if you do just what you're prescribed, I don't think your recovery will be very good. So the big point that I make over and over again in the book is that your recovery is entirely in your hands. Certainly they can help you with things. Certainly PT is excellent. Another thing I learned about PT is that most people drop out of it. I didn't know if you know this, but most people who get prescribed physical therapy or recommended, referred to it, I guess, most people only get it for a week or two, and then they say, well, I already know these exercises, so I'm just, you know, I'm going to go home and lift a few weights and I'll be okay. And so they think, well, I've already learned everything I can in physical therapy. And I know this is true because when I was scheduling physical therapy, they said, well, we can only get you one appointment now, but by the time you get in, a bunch of appointments will be open because people drop all the time, usually after a week or two. And so I looked into this, and it's really true. So what happens is PT is only as good as what you bring to it. So when I went to PT, man, I had a huge list of questions, and I said, can you measure this? Can you measure that? So they put me on every machine they had, and I started getting numbers, right? So that I knew when I was doing something right, it was getting better. Like that sensory organization testing, man, I got the numbers on that. And then a few weeks later, I did it again, and they said, whoa, your improvement is like way better than anybody in like the history of doing this. And in fact, one of the physical therapists said, your scores are higher than mine. And I said, okay, you know, because I was exercising it. So physical therapy is one of those things, you know, Dr. Mercola, it is just exactly like exercise, okay? If you bring nothing to it, no enthusiasm, no knowledge, no effort, you don't get much out of it, right? But if you bring a lot to it and that's part of the medical system, you definitely want to engage if you have a stroke. Get the best physical therapist you can, and the best occupational therapist, and the best, you know, speech therapist, because I had all three. Because I had some pretty severe, and you wouldn't know it, but I had some pretty severe problems when I had my stroke. But I recovered most of them, as you know, by November when I went to ACIM. When I agreed to go to the meeting, I didn't even know if I was going to be able to stand up. By the time I went to the meeting, it was no problem. It went pretty well.
You wouldn't have known you had a stroke.
Right. Well, the fast recovery, I'm just going to say the fast recovery was because of what I brought to the treatment. If you just do what they're asking you to do, I think most people have a pretty poor recovery. And I'm going to make a statement now. I will stand by this. Most people can and should expect a much, much better recovery than the medical system would expect or report if they simply do as much as they can, but also do as much as they can't do and keep exercising it and keep doing new things. I think it's generally true that everyone's recovery from wherever they are on that spectrum of disability, their recovery will be much, much better, like orders of magnitude better than the average.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty confident, though you are an anomaly, Bob, that the average person with a stroke would never have the motivation or the skill set to compile what you have. This book is just an absolutely extraordinary resource that anyone with a stroke, and in my view, should be required reading for pretty much every primary care clinician, because they need to understand this and provide it as a resource for the people under their care that need this type of information that really isn't out there consolidated in one place. Like
that's what I decided to do, put it all in one place. But let me tell you, Dr. Mercola, when I started doing this, it was very dark and very, very foreboding, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel, because the way I felt when I started, if you can imagine somebody putting like 4 or 6 really heavy, coarse wool blankets into boiling water and just letting them cool off just enough so that they don't hurt you, and then piling wet wool blankets on you, I felt like that was weighing on me the whole time. And I had to force myself to lift a foot. I remember I spent a week just getting to the point where I could lift and point my left foot. But I just kept doing it. And I said, I am not going to sit here doing nothing. So I think had I not done that, I would have been in very poor shape right now. But that's the main point I'm trying to get across, is that start early, move often, keep going, especially when you don't want to. Especially when, you know, you just had a stroke. You've earned your right to sit down and relax and don't do anything. And bad idea. You want to keep moving. And especially when I didn't want to, I would force myself to get up out of a chair. I would force myself to get up out of bed. I would move. I would lift feet up. I would point my arms. I would sit there in chairs and just point at, you know, light bulbs on the ceiling. And it did not feel good at all for about 3 weeks. But it took about 3 weeks. And by the time I got to physical therapy, I started feeling a lot better.
Yeah, it's actually extraordinary. So the key, though, is to have the motivation and the desire to improve. I mean, that's foundational, because you have the best resources in the world. Yep. And it's not going to help. So you got to be motivated internally. So you have to do whatever it takes to achieve that. And of course, a lot of that part of the lifestyle, diet, exercise, sleep. You're going to be limited exercise when you have a stroke, most strokes. But you know, that's the key, to have that motivation and get a resource like yours to understand these strategies. They can be very profoundly important, especially in the early stages.
I agree. And you know, I would have been happy if I could have just gotten on the internet and bought a book that told me all these things. That would have been great. But there's 2 things. First of all, I have way more resources available to me than the average person. I did have a lot, because, you know, I can pick up the phone and I can call 5 or 6 or 7 neurophysiologists and I'll talk to them right away. So the average person probably can't do that. And I had an education background in this, so I knew the questions to ask and the things to look at. But secondly, you know, there really wasn't a good resource. And I thought to myself, you know, I kept thinking, well, and I even asked when I was at the hospital, well, are they going to give me some recommendations? Oh, yeah. And I could hardly say that sentence, by the way. Are they going to tell me what to do? And one of the nurses said, oh, yeah, we have a stroke booklet, and it tells everything about stroke. But if you read it, it's like a cartoon, right? It's like, you just had a stroke. So go ahead and rest, and don't forget to take your medicine. You know, and I was like, oh, no, it's got to be better than this. And so I'm going through Amazon, and there's some good books on stroke, right? They're all sort of like, this is what, you know, 100 top experts say you should do for stroke, or this is, you know, something else. But what I wanted to do was collect every resource related to exercise, lifestyle, attitude, choices, that kind of thing that I could. And there's nothing in there that I didn't try. I didn't just list a bunch of junk, right? Everything in there I've done. You know, you can call me out on this at some point, but even the really strange things, I tried them. If it seemed to me to be stupid and hokey, it's not in the book, because the book was originally 850 pages. So I put stuff out. Yeah, so I wrote more than you thought, Dr. Mercola. I really did. But I got it down to about 600, and it was way too long. So I actually got the stuff that I think you need to know on the first day, and I compressed that into a second book. I sent that a copy of that to you also. It's called Stroke of Luck Now. So that if you need something to know right now, what should I do right now? You know, I'm in the ER, I'm being, you know, admitted for a stroke. What should I do right now? I boiled all these things down, just the essential points of which exercises you should be thinking about and safety points you should be keeping in mind, and that's it. And I made both of those as ebooks, as inexpensive as, you know, Kindle publishing would let me make them.
Yeah, that is great. So, you know, in the United States, where most of the people will be viewing this today, 250 people will have a stroke. 250 people. So if you happen to be viewing this and you know one of those people, or have had someone within the last few days, then get them a copy. If you know someone who's elderly and at high risk or has high blood pressure, then get them a copy, because ideally they need it when it occurs. You don't want to be waiting to have I mean, if they prefer reading print, then get the book. Otherwise, you can purchase it electronically. But it's literally a resource that should be in every stroke center in the country, and it really needs to be there. And I'm not sure what it could take to do that, but maybe you can donate a copy to them, and because it has so much potential for radically improving needless pain and suffering.
Well, that was my objective, and I can tell you, I'm quite certain that that's not the way they're thinking at the hospital, because probably 8 or 10 times I would have a neurologist, you know, a physician, ask me, "Hey, what are you doing?" as I'm doing these exercises. And I would tell them, "Well, I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. I'm going to keep doing it until I can do it." And I had 2 or 3 guys say to me, "You know, that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Like, tell people that." And I'm like, you know, come on, why not? It's obvious, right? Yeah. So in a way, everything in the book is just obvious when you think about it. So there's nothing deep, revelatory, you know, in the book. It's just all the obvious stuff collected into one place.
Yeah, and there's a term in Latin, it's actually used in medicine sometimes called res ipsa loquitur, or the facts speak for themselves, and you're the classic illustration of that. I mean, yeah, maybe a wacky idea or is intuitively obvious, but you've done it and you've got this fantastic result that is just about as good as you could possibly anticipate.
Yeah, well, actually, I think in some ways it's better than I anticipated, but to be perfectly honest, some things I'm still working on, but they are getting better. Like I have this kind of swimminess in my vision, so I feel like I'm off balance, but I'm actually recovering balance better than I did before. So some of my neural circuits are better. A couple of them still need to recover, but because I'm keeping neuroplasticity up, they're actually recovering slowly, but they're getting better, and I notice it over time.
Yeah, well, you're not even a year into this, so it's pretty amazing with what you've done.
Well, thanks.
Any other insights that you'd like to share, or observations from your experience?
Well, I do think that you know, there are lifestyle things you can do to reduce the risk of ever having a heart attack or stroke or anything like that, and it's all on Mercola.com, and that's all stuff that I wish I. And funny thing is, I was doing all these things, you know, weightlifting and all this stuff was a big part of my life. I even owned a gym until 5 years ago. They had to give it up because I had so much pain. But you know, as you can see on Mercola.com, there's all kinds of exercises that have been shown scientifically to correlate with very, very, very low probability of heart attack and other, you know, vascular problems and stuff. So I recommend doing that kind of thing. And I also recommend a lifestyle of cultivating neuroplasticity. It just makes you a better person, you know. It makes everything better about your nervous system. That's
as you said in the book, and you mentioned here, is that you don't have to have a stroke to benefit from these strategies, because we're always growing, and hopefully always growing, and recovering, developing new skill sets, and, you know, challenging ourselves with novel movements and strategies, so that we can continue to keep the brain going. And you know, we're talking about stroke and acute loss of physical function and skill sets and senses, but what's really important to know is that and I'm not sure that there's certainly no studies done it, but it's highly likely that the same strategies will also radically decrease your likelihood of getting what's coming to be a tsunami of an epidemic or pandemic, which is Alzheimer's. There's neurodegenerative diseases. So, you're getting 2 for 1 essentially.
I think that that's an excellent thought. I think it is extremely likely that you are correct. And I think that the more that you exercise these kinds of things, the less likely it is that you'll get Alzheimer's. In fact, I've had this discussion with my colleague, Dr. Mark Pomerdal, who is a neurosystems physiologist, and he brought the same point up. He said, you know what, I bet if because he and I were talking about these exercises, he and I talk every day because we're very close research colleagues. And he said, if you're doing these exercises to recover from stroke, he said, everything he's ever seen indicates that it also, collaterally reduces the chances for virtually every other neurodegenerative disease.
Well, just the intermittent fasting, we don't have to wait. I mean, the research is pretty clear, solid, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, because when you have calorie restriction interventions, I mean, it's well documented to decrease these inflammatory cascades that radically increase your risk for Alzheimer's, like NF-kappa beta.
Yep.
And amyloid plaques and tau tangles.
Absolutely. So there's I'm not an expert in that. And so I point to it and I say, go read something about it if you're interested in this. So on many points in the book, especially the latter half of the book, I point to a lot of these things, but I hadn't really explored them fully. And also for me, the horse was out of the barn somewhat. I had already had 2 strokes, right? Mm-hmm. So even though I was trying to prevent another stroke, I was also trying to maximize this recovery. So although I point to those things a lot, and I say, you should read about this or read about that, here's a link, or 2, or here's some scientific papers. Part of it was that, for my book, what I wanted to do was collect a lot of really simple things you could do. So I ended up writing several hundred pages of exercises and things you could do that require no money, no equipment, no special space, no special training, nothing like that. And that's the wonderful thing about intermittent fasting, is that it doesn't cost you anything. In fact, it saves you 10 or $20 a day.
Yeah,
right?
Well, potentially, depending on what your eating habits are. Yeah, it definitely saves money.
Well, in my case, I probably saved half of my food budget.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, just again, the caution, Bob, is to make sure that, especially as you regain your musculoskeletal ability and ability to do exercise, when you're having strength training days, that's the day when you really want to increase your protein, your carbs, and calories, so that you can, because you're activating autophagy, but then you want to get the rebuild and activate mTOR.
Yeah, I actually do that. I didn't want to get too much into the details of it, because I think everybody needs to do that, what's right for themselves. But I actually do strength training twice a week. And on those days, actually leading up to those events, I actually eat a lot of protein, a lot of carbs, a lot of food. So,
and what I've learned too, especially from some other researchers, is that doing your exercises fasting is even better, because then your growth hormone levels are pretty high. And in the fasted state, you can really activate it. And then within an hour or two, maybe 18, 20, 40-hour fast, or partial fast, but then it's when you throw the protein and the calories on, and you can have essentially feast. You have these feast and famine cycles, which is
exactly right. And if you think about it, that almost perfectly matches the way that it would have been Paleolithically, right? Like,
absolutely.
When do you feast? You feast after the big hunt, right?
Right.
Not before. You feast after you got the big windfall, whatever it was you hunted and gathered. So I agree with you. I actually like to work out when I'm fasted. And that's actually, I like to do all kinds of physical training, especially biking, which different now that I've had a couple strokes, but I still like to do those fasted. But a lot of times it helps if I actually eat more, like 24 hours ahead of that.
Yeah,
it's surprising. So I kind of fast myself, but so the carbohydrate, as you know, the carbos don't work that way. So you kind of got to time it, but definitely. I agree with you, yeah. And I think there should be a variation. You should go feast and famine. I don't think, no matter what, no matter how you cut the cake up, continuous feasting, as is the American lifestyle, is not good for you.
Well, that's what you did, and that was probably your biggest risk factor for having the stroke, is the continuous feasting.
Yeah,
so
well,
without the restriction of calories regularly.
Right, exactly. But once I got going, boy, it was easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm absolutely astonished that you're able to compile such a valuable resource, and I firmly believe that everyone watching this should pick up a copy, because you never know when you're going to need it. And not necessarily you have to read it, because it is a comprehensive encyclopedic resource and reference for anyone who has a stroke. So I'm sure that if you are fortunate enough to not personally go through this, or someone in your family go through it, then you are going to know a friend or a relative or a neighbor who is, and you can immediately give them the book, and they will have probably the best compilation of detailed, specific instructions on how to recover their lost function. So I couldn't recommend this book more.
It's written at a pretty, I think the book, as I wrote it, is written at a pretty readable level, right? But there's a lot of ideas layered on top of each other. So you might get a new idea every line in the book, saying, or you can do it this way, or you can do it that way, or if you do this variation, it'll do it differently. You know, and then the other thing, because I wanted everyone to be able to experience neuroplasticity, the best way that I could do that was that I discovered this way of this different written language called LEET, L-E-E-T. You may have heard of it. And so the back of the book has just got about 5 or 6 different texts converted into LEET, which is just where they take letters and numbers and they switch them. So the letter L becomes the number 1. And the letter E becomes the number 3, and then T becomes the number 7. And at first, when you see it, it is complete gibberish. But it's so interesting, because when your mind, and there's an example of this at the museum right there in Orlando, at the Believe It or Not Museum, Ripley's Believe It or Not, they have a big wall mural of LEET. And the interesting thing is, from the beginning, where you can almost not read it at all, by the time you get to the end, you can read it quite easily. And that is exactly what's going on with neuroplasticity. You can actually, if a person's paying attention, I try to emphasize this, you can feel your own neuroplasticity kicking in as your brain rewires itself to read English written differently. You know,
I'm actually surprised, and I reluctantly accepted the gift to review this, and I said, yeah, okay, what's Bob going to put together on this? But I was just shocked. I mean, you hit it out of the park with this one.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.